Hello, welcome to the PerpCast. I'm your host, Ray, the social media and PR manager for Perp Games. We've created this podcast to further show our support to the wider games and virtual reality industry. On this show, we chatted to like Ian Higdon from Eurogamer, Andreas Juliusson from Fast Travel Games, and Halo, Destiny and Golan composer Marty O'Donnell. And this week, we have another very special guest joining us from Neat Corporation. Please welcome Neat's creative director, Linnéa Harrison. Thanks so much for joining us, Linnéa. How's it going?
It's going pretty great. How about with you?
Yeah, pretty good. We've had some terrible weather here in Cardiff, unfortunately. It's been absolutely hammering it down, so I haven't really been outside much.
No.
It's been horrendous here, but it's that time of year, I guess, so yeah, I got to deal with it.
I feel you. Sweden isn't known for its light winters.
I bet. Does it get really cold there?
Oh, freezing. Everything is frozen outside. My dog loves it. I hate it.
Yeah, I can imagine dogs really lapping that up at this time of year, actually.
Definitely. But it makes for good tech development, so we like to sit inside and work on our games.
Yeah, I suppose, yeah, you get more time with the work that you're doing, but yeah, outdoor stuff is probably a bit of a no-go at times.
Definitely.
Well, thanks so much for joining us. It's really cool to chat to you today.
Yeah, sure thing.
On this show today, we're going to be chatting a bit about budget cuts, the upcoming sequel Budget Cuts 2 Mission Insolvency, as well as your ambitious early access VR project called Garden of the Sea. So really looking forward to talking about that. We're also going to learn a little bit more at Linnéa's earlier career, what it's like to work in VR, and much, much more. So we're going to dive into those discussion points now and really sort of find a bit more about you. So tell us a bit about yourself and how you got into the industry and your journey to Neat Corporation and your role as their creative director.
Ooh, okay. All right. We're starting big. All right. So I grew up in the US and I always had a passion for creating experiences and creating fun moments and trying to understand why humans enjoyed play. And I kind of got into games by accident. I didn't realize that that's what I wanted to work with, but once I tried my first game jam, I was hooked. So after that, I kind of made it my mission to get into the games industry. And I didn't know what working in the games industry was going to be like, but I figured if a game jam was that fun, then, well, working on games couldn't be much different. So I finally made my way as an intern at Treyarch, was my first internship.
Nice.
Working on Call of Duty Black Ops. That was a blast. And then I kept working on Call of Duty for a while once I made my way into the industry after the internships. And yeah, it was super fun. I got to work on COD Modern Warfare 3 and Black Ops 2.
Wow.
It was super, super fun, especially working on the zombies component. That was like, dream come true at that point.
Yeah.
And I kind of became obsessed with the original Mirror's Edge as well, because it was absolutely gorgeous and doing things with lighting and color that we had not seen before at that generation of video games. And I was kind of thrilled by what you could do if you understood the technology. So then I started becoming very excited about like understanding technology at its forefront and trying to utilize it for what it's best at. So I heard that they were going to create another Mirror's Edge game over at DICE, and so I made it my mission to go work at DICE. So I did, and I worked on Battlefield, Battlefront, and eventually Mirror's Edge 2, which was a dream come true. And that was just around the time when we were transitioning into PBR in the games industry, which was a big shift for us in terms of how we thought with rendering pipelines. But it was really fun, again, to be like at that forefront of technology and kind of pushing and figuring out what is this going to be like. So when I started feeling a little, I don't want to say burned out, but kind of just like I felt like I had done AAA, right? Like when I was done building Mirror's Edge 2, I kind of felt like, okay, I've done that. That was my goal. That's it. But I still kind of had this excitement for technology at the forefront and what can we do with it. And that's when I realized that virtual reality was that's what I wanted to do with an indie space. And of course, the team at Neat Corp that had done the demo for Budget Cuts was freaking amazingly talented, super nice people. So I fit right in and joined them to make the first Budget Cuts. The rest is history.
Yeah, I mean, it's amazing the amount of AAAs that you've done as well prior to Neat. I mean, obviously, like you say, starting a Treyarch and working on Call of Duty, I mean, that just been incredible in terms of the actual learning experience for you and in terms of actually working on such a massive project. I mean, how was that? How did that sort of like experience kind of help translate you to be at such a forefront and be such a key figure in your own independent studio?
Well, it was really quite different. I mean, indie studios, smaller studios work at such a different pace and with such different information than larger studios. Large studios tend to have a lot of weight behind them when it comes to hardware partners, having direct line of communication with what is happening. Like we had PS4s a year and a half, 2 years before they were out, and we knew exactly how they were going to perform. So that was a little bit different than working at a smaller studio where, yes, we have a lot of communication with the hardware developers for VR, but it's not quite as, like, they are not spending 110% energy in making sure that we get stuff super early, but rather in making sure that the final product is really good. So in that sense, I think the pace of information is a little bit different working AAA to indie. But also, I'd say for me, it just was kind of second nature to take a lot of the like organizational stuff with me from AAA, but also these sort of workflows in terms of how do we polish, what do we look at when we're looking at lighting from a design standpoint, from an art standpoint? How do we bring that over? And what, at the end of the day, is the user most likely to experience? Like, how can we get the most bang for buck development-wise? So rather than, obviously it's a nice balance as an indie studio. You get to focus on building the things that you think are fun to build, but then also having the knowledge of what can be the most useful to build was really useful from AAA.
Yeah, I can imagine that'd be so useful to have that information. And I know some people actually start to build an independent studio from scratch without having that experience. And I guess many of the members of the team at Neat as well had that experience going in. But yeah, that was really useful. And I guess touch a bit upon what you mentioned as well about game jams, because that kind of inspired you to get into the industry. And I noticed you actually made your own game during a game jam over Halloween, which was really, really cool. So just wonder if you could tell me a bit about the process of making a game from a game jam. For instance, if someone has never actually kind of got into trying a game jam, they've always thought, I'd love to do that, but I've never had the courage to do it, or I've never thought I'd like to do it. What kind of things are involved in making a game in a game jam, and is it a good way to help develop your skill set?
I definitely think it's great for developing skill sets and like jumping in. The whole point is kind of, you're a group of people, maybe you've never even met each other before, and this game jam is when you first meet each other, but you're just a group of people who are trying to figure this out together. And if you make something, then that is worth celebrating. It's never going to be a huge AAA MMO with narrative branching paths or whatever, but you just make something that is fun and playful, this small little bite-sized morsel, and it feels really good to create something new. And usually you get that in game jam experiences. So I mean, for me, my first game jam experience was Global Game Jam, and I always recommend, if people are interested in game development, definitely go to Global Game Jam. It happens in January every single year. There are game jams all over the world. There's probably one very close to you, and people from games, people from tech who just are excited about games, or people who have no idea how to build a game at all, or kids, all kinds of different types of people come together to build these. And so usually what they'll try to do is make sure that each team has a couple people who maybe have built a game before or knows an engine. But again, if you don't know anything, that's fine. The only thing you need is a laptop, or maybe not even a laptop. Sometimes you don't even need that, but you just need the attitude of being willing to try to figure things out and work together. And that's kind of the magic that you get reminded of every time you do a game jam, because it can be really easy to lose sight of that when you're developing larger projects with teams that you've known for a long time. You can kind of end up in these habits, just like you do in any relationship, I think. And it's really important to have these game jams, or to have periods when you are iterating fast or doing something a little bit different, in order to be reminded of like how making games can be really exciting and fun and kind of, loose.
Yeah. There's also the time pressure, I guess, as well, of getting it done in that short space of time.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I'm a huge proponent of like anti-stress in everything that I do, from large game projects to smaller game jams. So I will always be the person that's like, hey, it's not important that we implement the ability for the character to jump. The character can run around. It's super cute. It's fun. We've already built something. Go get some sleep, or like go take a break and take a walk, or like go watch some Netflix for an hour, because because I think, when you're doing game jams, you do get in this like tunnel vision mode. And we do that when we're developing games over a longer period of time too. But I honestly think that we get so used to being anxious, being stressed, that it can be really important to be reminded to not be for a little bit.
Yeah.
So I'm trying really hard with all of the game jams that I organize and also participate in to kind of be the voice of anti-stress, so to speak.
Yeah, and I suppose that's a really interesting way to, like you mentioned, not using the jump button. So I guess you learn about your game and kind of figure out, well, actually, does it really need this? And perhaps it gives you some creative blue sky thinking to kind of think, well, actually, you could do something different. And that can lead, I guess, to more creative options and opportunities for games that perhaps you hadn't initially considered because you were kind of in the tunnel vision mode, as you said, about using a jump button to make sure the character does this thing. But actually, you've figured out a new way of creating something within the game, and actually it could lead to more creative options down the road.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that's something that is overlooked often with games, where people often think like, oh, well, this other game has this and this game has that. And especially with the AAA adventure titles that you're seeing today, they have every single system built in. And we're getting so used to seeing that we assume that our game also needs that, right? But I think what we're starting to see is the second wave of like a renaissance towards simpler, focused, elegant game design, where they're focusing more on, no, this is actually what my game does. If the character doesn't jump, or if there's no tool select system for branching your growth tree of skill sets or whatever, then that's fine, because maybe it doesn't serve the greater purpose of the game, right? So like, using game design within constraints can often lead to much more creative and interesting solutions, like you mentioned.
Yeah, that's the awesome thing. And I guess talking a bit about your kind of background as well, and like how you've gone into that working at the major studios, and like you've obviously used that creativity to kind of work on some major projects you love, but then you've also had to now move from the flat screen world into kind of the virtual reality world. And so working on building an engine like on a Frostbite 2, and then you're moving into this fully immersive virtual reality world of budget cuts. Aside from the sort of the obvious aesthetical changes and the difference in the way that people play those sort of games, what are sort of the main technical differences in creating a virtual reality game, and based on your time, say, working on a Mirror's Edge or a Call of Duty?
So for me, the biggest difference is how I approach building the world and guiding the player. For instance, in AAA or in flat screen games, we'd always say like, no, this needs to be a bigger punch. We need to like impact the player more. No, we need to crank this up to a level. The explosions need to be bigger. The grit needs to be grittier. The music and the sound all needs to be really, really impactful in order to get the message across, right? Like everything needs to be cranked up to 11. But what we found, especially in the end of Budget Cuts 1, there was this level that I don't know if you played all the way through, but for those who have, the very last level is quite different in tone in that it's very scary and dark. And originally, when we played it, we were thinking that we were going to crank it up to 11, similarly to how we had all done previously on flat screen games, that we would have to add in all of these extra moments to heighten the tension on this level. But we just played it with the lights off in the level, and it was so freaking scary, like, oh my gosh, that we realized that one of the biggest differences is, no, you really have to pull back on some of the atmospheric elements in VR, because otherwise it's going to be like you're going to get PTSD from being in the space, and that's not what we want for our players. Obviously, we want them to have a good time, and we want them to feel immersed, but at the same time, we don't want them to be overwhelmed by something that is much more than we intended, right? The other thing that I found really interesting moving from flat screen to virtual reality, and especially room scale virtual reality, was how much more we rely on previous learnings from architecture or interior design. We use those a bit when we're looking at AAA, like normal video games in terms of leading the player, but most of the time, because the camera is much more locked in those flat screen games, what we're using more of is actually two-dimensional composition from paintings. But when we move into virtual reality, in order to guide the player or like create different pressure in the space or use architectural lines to guide the player, then we need to really look at those fields which have already developed these systems and these methods for how to do that with humans. And that's been really useful.
Yeah, chatting to a few people on the PerpCast about the way they've worked in virtual reality, and some have come from a AAA background as well. And it's really really interesting to hear the different perspectives that people had coming in, because some people had never like experienced VR until they started at the studio. Some people they'd been playing it a bit before, and they were all very different stories coming into it, because it's still such a new technology that people are still learning about now and how to get the best out of it. But yeah, it's really interesting to hear about how you've kind of made that transition. And obviously with Budget Cuts 1, it went on to get such a positive reception as well, with major sites picking up on it and the community really responding to the focus and the stealth and the puzzle solving element of it. Can you tell us a bit about the conceptual stages of the game and kind of what input you had on it and how challenging it was to build that from the early days of VR?
Yeah, sure. So I wasn't on the original Budget Cuts demo. That was Marco, Freya, and Jenny who built that with a little bit of help from outside contractors.
Right.
But so they basically had the core of the gameplay figured out. When I came on, they said, yeah, we're throwing knives at robots and we have this portal teleporting mechanic with the gun and it's super cool. And they had that, but we didn't know if we wanted to build like just a bunch of little vignettes of that, or if we just wanted to build some kind of open world style game where you could kind of go wherever you wanted, or what we wanted to build. So eventually we went with this more linear narrative approach to the game, which is what we have now, which is much more like story-based, mission-based, because we wanted to kind of have a little bit more control of guiding the player into these situations where choices were meaningful between stealth and combat, because that's usually the big trade-off in Budget Cuts, is how you approach combat scenarios, if it's via stealth or by being clever by using the space in some way. And those are the moments that kind of bring you the most magic with our core systems that had already been built. So that was really, really interesting, I thought. Some of the difficulties were for us because we had built the core system of the game for room scale VR. It became very difficult afterwards, to backward induct and figure out how forward-facing seated play would work in a way that still felt good. Because so many of the nice little moments in our game relied on room scale VR, like climbing around on your hands and knees in this ceiling space and like hitting your head on the floor when you're actually trying to put it through a hole in the ceiling in the game, or like ducking behind desks or furniture in the game, which is really hard to do if you're sitting at your chair in front of your computer, which is how most people play their Oculus Rifts, which is what most of our players had. So it became really, really interesting to try to figure out what's that sweet spot where it's not really a compromise, but you still get the same experience of like playing cat and mouse and ducking and still feeling the physicality of this space without losing the approachability of being able to sit seated forward facing. And that I think was really interesting.
Yeah, as you say, that it's about learning that kind of distinction and how you can kind of, I guess, control these games. I mean, it's not as simple as just using two thumbsticks and kind of like a couple of buttons and you can do whatever you need to. You know, it's such a different way to maneuver and around in the world. But yeah, I mean, I suppose with the game as well, like you've talked about, you know, throwing knives at robots and like the desks, and obviously there's a real unique sense of humor in the game that lets you throw coffee cups and receive faxes, and there's lots of witty dialogue. And so what are sort of the main inspirations behind the humor and the general sort of the feeling of the game?
Honestly, I would say that a large portion of it was initially inspired by the humor that we just have at the office between us. When we were sitting around, many of us would like crack jokes or puns or make observations about silly things that people do in real life. It's a lot about wordplay. So we honestly just started writing all of those down. And then when we went into the decision to create this narrative story, we took on Amelia, who was our writer for this game. And she had this similar, very like dark but witty kind of humor. And that ended up being like really resonating with all of us. So we were like just leaning into this 110% and trying to put in as many kind of stupid, silly moments. Like what can you do in VR that you can't do in the real world? But also how can we kind of poke fun at the real world through this lens of the office landscape? Because again, many of us, having come from larger studios to create an indie studio, have this sort of indie punk attitude of like making fun of larger office-scapes and that normal kind of life with the 9 to 5. So we kind of wanted to make sure that that made it into the game as well, which I think it definitely did.
Yeah, absolutely. Because as someone who's worked in office work for about 15 years, I definitely got some of those references, and I definitely picked up on a lot of different things.
Yeah, definitely.
I do want to talk a bit about, obviously there was a great reception to budget cuts and there was a lot of positivity, but there was a bit of negativity as well, and mentions of different bugs that affected gameplay from within the community. And I guess I wanted to ask you, as a studio and as an individual, when you receive feedback like that, I mean, how does it impact everyone at the studio, and what sort of processes do you kind of consider and go through when you take that feedback on board?
So one of the big things for us was when we first released budget cuts, leading up to the launch, there were a lot of delays in the launch of the game because we kept discovering new bugs that we didn't know about before, like that popped up last minute. And that sort of thing is very common with game development.
Yeah.
Like bugs pop in left and right and you're like, I fixed this like a week ago. Why is this back? And it just does sometimes. But one of the things that we felt going into the launch was, there's this potential for these bugs to keep kind of popping up. And that was very scary for us because obviously budget cuts being kind of a little bit of our baby as a game development studio, a new one that's releasing their very first game. Like the demo had been released, everyone had loved it. There was all this pressure and all this these eyes on the actual game that releasing it, we kind of always knew that we were going to disappoint a little bit because there was such a big following from the demo. Like even if it was bug free, the gameplay was going to be slightly different, right? And so the bug fixing process, like we knew we would have to fix a lot of bugs. We kind of took that on earlier, so it wasn't a big surprise when it came out with, there's some throwing that feels different on Oculus versus Vive, or some of the Windows mixed reality tracking for throwing is off. And that's, that comes down to us being a smaller team, not having tested as much, and also it being our first game that we released and, quite honestly, just missing a few points that, we should have looked over much more thoroughly. But again, at the end of the day, you kind of need to just release it and start moving forward. And working towards getting the game being exactly what we all wanted it to be eventually, with all of the patches and all of the updates, was something that we all felt really good about because we were like, yes, finally people are going to be able to play the game that we've built the way we've intended for it to be played, which is, fairly bug-free or fairly issue-free in terms of the main mechanics, and being able to experience more of the story because of less save issues, right? So, I mean, going into the other games that we've built, it's obviously been a lot to learn from, but it is difficult with a small team, I'd say, like making sure that you cover all of your bases all the time, which is something that I think both from playing AAA games, but also coming from a space where we build AAA games, feels quite different. Like needing to be able to let go of some smaller bugs and say, maybe I can live with that. This book looks really weird when it falls over. Like maybe I can live with that because it's not super core, but definitely making sure that we talk to and listen to a lot of the players. And one of the things that came out of this that was really great was we created a Discord community for our gamers that are playing our games so that we could talk to them and be more direct with like, hey, you're having a bug? Awesome. Can you tell me what setup you're using? Can you tell me if you have your antivirus installed? Can you give me a crash report or like the log from the crash? So that really helped us debug a lot of stuff faster, but also kind of figure out, of all of these different constellations for computers, what is it that we were seeing the most of, and we could prepare for the next games. So that was also really useful.
It's quite interesting chatting good about the transition. Obviously, we've chatted to Marty and Andreas in previous PerpCasts, and Marty's obviously come from Bungie, and when he left, he said they had like 800 staff.
Yeah.
And now he's obviously set up a high-wire studio, which is like got about 30 staff. And he said like, it's obviously you have the transition of working in the big studio and you've got all that huge chain of command, but the kind of the flexibility that's afforded to you in an independent studio is just amazing, and you can, and you can have more one-to-one interactions with people, and the way that like kind of things are done are just so different. But it's nice that you can have more of a connection with your fans perhaps than you would have if you've been working on the latest Call of Duty or something like that. that. So that's a really cool thing. But I guess like chatting a bit more about that, you've mentioned about the bringing budget cuts to different headsets. And we know that you've been working really hard on bringing the original game to PlayStation VR as well.
Yes.
Opening up to new audiences. So I just wanted to chat a little bit more about kind of the challenges of porting a game to PlayStation VR from other headsets, because obviously it's coming out quite a while after the original release. What can players expect from the PlayStation VR version that perhaps they hadn't from previous versions of the game?
Right. So there's a couple things that differ when developing for PC, like high-end PC VR versus like PSVR. And I would say that you get a similar thing when developing for a headset like Quest, where for PlayStation VR, they have this very rigorous testing process and release pod process. So you know when you're purchasing a PlayStation VR product that it's going to be fairly bug-free, it's going to be fairly performant, and it should work in a fairly standard way, right? So a lot of the stuff that we had discussed with the first game for high-end PC was really initially difficult to translate over to PSVR, but then because we decided to do those design changes for forward-facing seated play, it actually translated really well to PlayStation VR. So that just means that we have more ways for the player to understand what direction they're facing in the real world versus in virtual reality, but we don't want that to be bringing you out of the gameplay. So we just have informative elements in the world that help you relate to where you are in the real world, which I think is really useful. The other thing is that we're trying to have these moments where I know that a lot of people play PSVR seated, but we're hoping that we've created more scenarios where you're kind of encouraged to pick things up from the ground or duck. And so we're hoping that people will move their coffee tables out of the way and kind of get up off of the sofas when they're playing PSVR and play it a little bit more. And hopefully, other games such as Apex Construct or Beat Saber have also helped encourage people to play more standing or standing space for PSVR as well. So they can kind of get this full range of experience. The other thing that we're bringing to PSVR that we haven't done before is a map that is specifically built for PSVR. And that's something that, we didn't have PlayStation dev kits until about a year ago. And that's when we started to realize that, if we're building a level for PlayStation VR, what we want to do is we want to kind of play off of its ability to create spaces in your living room in this space that you're so used to that you haven't been able to experience before. So at the same time, we need to discourage the player from turning more than 90 degrees in any given location in order to progress through the level. So we created this kind of golden circle spiral level. You'll get to see it when it's released, of course, and play it. But it's a really cool sort of ode to PlayStation VR, I would say.
Nice. Yeah, and it does sound it's quite a bit different. And I guess you've taken a lot of the feedback that was on board from the original release as well, and kind of almost a definitive edition of the game, so to speak.
Yeah, it's very nicely bundled. Everything works really well. So we're hoping that as PSVR has such a large player base, that lots of people will be experiencing VR in a nice way in this game for the first time. So we're looking forward to seeing many more hilarious gameplay videos of people playing once it hits PSVR.
Yeah, I think as you say, it opens it up to so many more audiences, a lot of channels and YouTubers, etc. That they are PSVR exclusive. Exactly. So it's going to be great to see people experience the game for the first time as well, which is always a lot of fun, I imagine.
Yeah.
And speaking a bit about, because you mentioned Apex Construct, and obviously you've been working with Fast Travel Games at the moment to bring Budget Cuts 2 Missions Insolvency out next month as well. So you've got lots going on at Neat Corporation at the moment.
Yes.
So we chatted a bit to Andreas last week about how the collaboration came about from Fast Travel's point of view, but I just kind of wondered how Neat Corporation approaches collaboration. I mean, was there any concern on your side for perhaps sharing your intellectual property with another studio?
Well, for us, it wasn't really a concern because Fast Travel and Neat Corporation had shared offices before when we were working on the first Budget Cuts. So we actually shared an office because both of our studios were so small at that time and we didn't have the numbers that we do now. I think both of our studios have doubled since then in numbers, which is crazy to think about.
Yeah.
But back at that point, they were developing Apex Construct, we were developing Budget Cuts, and of course, when you're developing a game, you always want playtesters who aren't working on the game all the time. So we would constantly be bugging each other like, hey, do you have a second? Can you come play my level? And vice versa. Like we would come test their bow mechanics out or like see how they were handling different things in VR. And it was really useful that we were both doing virtual reality because we were and using the same engine as well. So it was really useful to be able to tackle a lot of similar issues at the same time and have a larger group of people to kind of bug fix or, debug things with. So we already had this kind of like, I almost want to say like a sibling collaboration where like we respected each other's space and like, they're doing their game and I'm not going to design their levels for them.
I like that. That's a nice way to put it.
Yeah, like that's your side of the room. This is my side of the room. But also, can you come over here and help me out with this? Was super, super useful. I think it also helps that, we kind of felt very strong that Budget Cuts 1 was such a good and strong identity for the IP, right? Like you kind of get this identity of what is the gameplay? Well, it's this sort of stealth cat and mouse mix of gameplay through office spaces, right? And what is the art style? Well, it's this, direct light that's bounced off of iconic, colorful environments, right? So like the bright reds feel very Budget Cuts, of course, when you look at it. So coming into it, Fast Travel already had they had the experience of working with us before. They knew the IP from the first game, and they were bringing all their expertise of building outdoor environments, of building larger scale spaces that were a little bit less linear. And then they were also bringing, of course, the iconic bow and arrow gameplay that they know so well, which worked really well on a lot of the levels that we had been planning for Budget Cuts 2, because of course we wanted to expand on what the core systems could support in our game. We were like, okay, we've built these fun little toys of playing around with these supervisors and trying to hide, but how can we use those in new constellations and new environments that kind of bring out new gameplay spaces? And that's something that they were able to help us out with a lot.
Yeah, the project sounds a lot more ambitious now because, as you say, we talked a bit about before how Budget Cuts 1 was quite office insulated and, how it was an indoor kind of project. But now we've seen from the trailer, it's all outdoor. You're on the top of a train, you're kind of like you're on tops of buildings. So it seems a lot more ambitious and a lot bigger in scope. So that definitely makes a lot of sense how that collaboration's come about.
Yeah, it's really useful. We were able to rely on a lot of the core systems that we built from the first game. So in many ways, we didn't have to rebuild those from the ground up. And a lot of the polish work that had gone into the patches for the first game were carried over now into Budget Cuts 2, of course. So we were able to kind of sit there with our spaces and just be like, well, why not? So hopefully they'll work out and we will not learn that there is a very good reason why not. But so far it's going really, really well. And the spaces are playing very differently than the first game.
I want to chat a bit more about Budget Cuts 2 briefly and just sort of like ask you a bit about what you're most excited about Budget Cuts 2 and compared to your time working on the original. And so what are some of the key differences that we haven't discussed in your view? And also what should players look out for? Like what sort of new gadgets and enemy types can they expect in Budget Cuts 2?
Ooh, okay. All right. So there's a lot of really cool stuff that's coming to the second one that I'm kind of like, when you're building a game and you have all these ideas and you have to face reality and let go of some of those ideas in order to make the game a reality.
Right.
That happened a lot with Budget Cuts 1 because, it was our first game. We were super excited. We were making it all ourselves. We didn't have a publisher or a producer executive that was telling us, no, you can't do that. No, you can't do that. So we were just building a billion ideas faster than we could build them. And so going into Budget Cuts 2, we finally got the chance then to flesh out a bunch more of these ideas. And a lot of that, for me as a creative director, falls down to how are we interacting with the world, right? Like, are you going from spaces that feel really iconic, or are you going from spaces that feel a little bit more mundane? Are you interacting with characters that make sense in the world, or are you just kind of running past them? So we kind of took a lot of the moments that we learned from the first game. Like, people really liked the Roombas moving around on the ground, and people really liked the smaller kind of moments, and kind of focused on these like little vignettes of moments with interacting with these smaller characters. So we decided to build upon that a lot more. So we've invested much more into like the characters, like worker robots and supervisor robots being much more charismatic and kind of leaning into them having these individual personalities and how this world kind of works on a deeper level. Like, what are they actually doing with their time? But we've also then built some new robots. So we have a couple new flying type of robot. We have a new bipedal enemy type that's going to be really difficult to beat. I actually personally still haven't been able to beat them because my aim is really bad. But we have a new gadget that is supposed to help that's much more explosive. So it's like a grenade that you're throwing. So that's supposed to officially help me, is why we built it, defeat these new enemy types. But I'm sure there's other people out there like me that, I mean, I'm the type of player that would always stealth up super close to the supervisor and then like stab them in the back, right? I'm not the type that would take the chance and throw from a distance. So I think this kind of gives players like me the option to have more chaotic long distance combat without needing to be as accurate as you would with a knife, for instance. So there's a lot of interesting moments like that that I think are going to happen in the second game.
Yeah, and I suppose it's going to create different ways to play as well. Like obviously people have got used to a certain way of playing with Budget Cuts 1, and now they're going to have to adapt their strategies a little bit more in Budget Cuts 2 with the different enemy types and the different gadgets. So I guess that'll, again, as we've talked about, the different challenges of controlling in VR, and I guess that presents some different challenges in how you've approached Budget Cuts 2 compared to the original.
Definitely. And I think one of the big things that we're doing this time is we're really trying to like make the control scheme and how you get onboarded into the game much more elegant. And that was something that we figured out with, we released this arcade patch for Budget Cuts 1, which was basically a package of 4 new levels with this game mode being very arcade-like and tallying up scores. But for that, we needed to be able to like onboard people super fast and make it super clean and super easy for them to understand. And so a lot of that learning and a lot of those systems that we built have gone straight into Budget Cuts 2 because it just makes so much more sense for people to learn the systems and the different control schemes that way, because it is a lot to keep track of when you have more tools, when you have lots of options for how to approach a scenario. We even have one level that is like purely non-linear. You can tackle it in any direction, any order you want. And I think that combined with the different, like all the different tool options you have, all the different like objects that you can interact with, and like distracting a robot or like hitting it on the head to stun it and then going into a tube or something. Like there's a lot of different ways that you can approach it. So I'm honestly really excited to see how people approach that level. There's like one specific level I'm super excited about.
Nice. I'm looking forward to it. And obviously you've got the upcoming beta as well. So I guess you're going to be getting a lot of feedback over that over the coming weeks. So
yes.
I guess that'll be a really cool way for you to learn a lot more about the game and how people are responding to it. And then obviously when the game drops, it'll be even more exciting for the team and yourself as well.
Oh, it is. It is such an exciting time getting close to launch because, as you said, like so many of the systems are in, so many of the levels are in. Now we just get to like see how people play with them and try to make sure that remains intact as we go into polishing and bug fixing.
Yeah, and as if Neat Corporation are not busy enough already working on Budget Cuts 1, Budget Cuts 2, you're also trying something very different in VR as well, which seems to have been a bit of a passion project for yourself, Garden of the Sea. You announced it at the Upload VR E3 showcase earlier this year, and it's been available in early access ever since. I just wonder if you could tell us a bit about Garden of the Sea, how it came into being, and what led you and other members of the team into making it.
Yeah, sure. So myself and Christopher, who were the 4th and 5th members of Neat Corporation, we had this like internal pitch day, all of us at Neat Corporation, where we said, okay, let's see what we're going to build next. What is the next game that we're going to build? So all of us came with like 5 or 6 different game ideas, and Christopher and I quite literally pitched the exact same game concept. And so we just kind of looked at each other and we're like, yeah, we have to make this. And it was really kind of an uphill battle because there were very few on the team who saw what we saw, if that makes sense, or like wanted to live in this world the same way we did. But we just kind of formed this like rogue coalition on the side and started like after work or on weekends, we were just like actually make the project. Wow. And so we built it up into this small little world. And I remember like the first time someone that wasn't Christopher or I went into this world, they put the headset on and it's just this tranquil green island with a little house and trees and nice calm music and blue serene water. They just laid down on the ground and took a big sigh and were like smiling. And we were like, yeah, this is what we all want. This is what we all need, sort of. Like this breath of fresh air, sigh of relief game where it's really fun, obviously, to work on budget cuts and all these stealth moments. But sometimes you need a calm breath of fresh air. So it kind of became this like nice duality to how we develop games is, when we're feeling excited and anticipatory and we have a lot of energy, we put more effort into budget cuts. But sometimes when you need a break, we just go and build a little plant for Garden of the Sea, or like build a little mission in Garden of the Sea. So it kind of ended up being like a little mini development vacation for our brains when we got kind of needed, like overloaded into stealth.
Yeah,
right?
Yeah. That's a really nice way to put it, actually, because it seems like you're working on 3 different projects, so that must be a lot. But at the same time, this is such a tranquil game, as you've said, and obviously the development for that is a lot more calm and relaxed, so to speak. That it does give you that opportunity to break away from what is essentially a AAA indie game in budget cuts too. Tell us a bit about Garden of the Sea then. So, what are sort of the main aims and objectives for the player, and what kind of cool things can you discover in the game?
Right. So, in Garden of the Sea, you're on this magical island and you have a hut and lots of creatures roaming around and lots of plants. And we haven't specifically set any goals or objectives for the players, but we have created systems that do sort of lend themselves towards either exploring the crafting side, like building a lot of different items and crafting like fences or trellises or barns or bridges or larger sort of systems that kind of grow naturally from their predecessors. So it's a branching crafting system. We also have a very, I want to say organic, but that feels a little cliche, growing system for the plants, which is going to be expanded upon in the future. But right now you can grow a bunch of different plants, harvest them, create more plants, more seeds, and they have different needs in terms of like how much soil space they need and water, and some of the plants can be used to craft other items. Some of the plants can be used to feed the creatures that are on the island, so you can get to know those a little bit better. And then we also want the creatures and the exploration of the island to be its own sort of space, so that people that don't want to grow plants or craft objects also have this sort of like adventurous explorative side to things. So we have a boat, we're going to have fishing, we have other islands you can explore and unlock, and there's other like new plants or new like we even have a treasure map, so you can go find lost treasure on the island. Cool. So it's all of these things that, like, as a kid, what would you do when you ran out in the forest behind your house? Like what kind of like imagination would you just run wild with? And that's kind of what we wanted to create this play space for all of us in, that makes us just really, really happy. Yeah. And that's kind of what we've built into the game and are going to continue to build into the game, are all these little systems and spaces for like imagination and creation. Yeah,
and I suppose that's the interesting thing as well, because when you announced at the showcase, you basically launched the game there and then on early access, which is quite unique in the VR space. We don't really see games released at that point on early access. And so with the early access period, because you're still in early access at the moment, from then to now, I mean, how much would you say the game has changed from when you first launched to today, really? I mean, what sort of big changes would you have noticed in the structure of the game?
Well, the current version of the game doesn't have as many large changes visible. It's mostly, we've been doing work behind the scenes to build systems that are robust enough to have all of the features and elements that we've started hearing from players that they definitely want to have. So we've started like planning for the future, so to speak, because we've created this roadmap of what systems and what mechanics we want to create first, and then off into almost infinity. There's like an endless number of ideas, which are all super brilliant, and I want them now. But unfortunately, they take time to make. So we've needed to go back and re-look at how we build both the save system, but also loading of new islands and stuff, because we want to create new spaces. But obviously, for performance reasons, we can't have everything loaded in at once. So we needed to go back and look at how that's going to work, so that all of this new stuff that we're going to build in the future is going to work really well. The other thing that we were able to get, and that was super exciting, was finger tracking on Knuckles, because this game, like, again, it's going to sound cliche, but it's a very hands-on game. Yeah. So it made sense, and like the in-game controllers are gloves, so it makes sense to have finger tracking, and it just connects you sort of with it in a way that, I mean, a lot of the core systems in the game, like planting or crafting or interacting with pets, if you think about doing those things in the real world, they are very focused on your hands and how your hands are touching these surfaces and being very tactile with manipulating them. So it felt like an obvious choice for supporting that.
Yeah, and with the process of development as well, because obviously this is a different way of developing your game compared to budget cuts. cuts. Obviously, I know you weren't there from the initial stages of creation, but in your opinion, from what you have seen in the development of budget cuts, I mean, has this been a lot smoother to develop? Obviously, I know the projects are very, very different, but in terms of how the community have responded via early access, I mean, would you say this has perhaps become a preferred way for yourself and the studio to work, being more open with development in the future?
I think it is something that we all really enjoy, being very open and communicative and transparent with like, hey, this is what we're working on. Hey, this is why you have or have not seen updates lately. This is us doing some coding in the background, just so you understand. And that is something that we all very naturally tend towards. Many of us are very transparent or have this tendency to be transparent with like our spaces on Twitter, just sharing what we're working on, both personally and professionally. So it kind of made sense for us. But it also has this like double-edged sword where you also still need to make sure that you're spending days and a little bit of time every day just making sure that you're communicating. So you really can't have these like a whole week anymore where you just sit with your headphones on and get work done. You kind of need to pull yourself out of it a little bit and like check up with the world and be like, hey, this is what's happening over here. By the way, we're still alive and we're still making stuff, and this is what we're making. So it has changed a little bit, but for the most part, I think it is something that we all really, really have enjoyed, being very open, and also just getting all of these ideas from the community has been really exciting because, I mean, they come up with stuff that we never would have.
And that's a great point, actually. I was going to ask you, I mean, is there a feature they've suggested, particular one that stands out that has really surprised you, one thing that you hadn't considered before? Yeah,
I mean, this one keeps coming up, and it's having a mount in VR.
Okay.
And so, like, one of the initial ideas was they want a seahorse so they can ride a seahorse.
That sounds cool.
And I know, it sounds really cool. And I'm like, well, we already have a boat, so technically it would be very similar in terms of movement,
right,
to the boat. It's technically a form of smooth locomotion, right? So, like, everyone who's been wanting smooth locomotion, hey, now you have it in a horse or a seahorse, right? So, like, it kind of solves a ton of things that we've been thinking about in a really elegant and fun way that we were just like, wow, this is such a cool idea. Of course, we need to have a seahorse in the game.
So I guess that opens up underwater as well, right? So kind of like looking around at underwater.
I know. Yeah, we need to build that part. We haven't built underwater yet. But we do want to.
So I guess that's the problem. It creates a solution to one problem. It opens up many, many more problems in the long term.
Well, it opens up opportunities to build more, which is really fun.
That's a really cool idea. That sounds a lot of fun. Yeah. And I guess talking a bit about that, because obviously there are community suggestions and there's a lot more coming in the game. But what can you tell us? What does the future look like for Garden of the Sea in the next sort of 5 to 6 months? And how long do you envisage the early access period lasting?
Originally we said like, our early access will probably be a year. But honestly, with all of the systems and features that we want to get in based on the community's feedback, it's probably going to be longer than a year for early access. Yep. The future of Garden of the Sea looks very bright and looks very happy, I would say. As soon as we're all done with Budget Cuts 2, we're going to throw much more energy and effort onto Garden of the Sea and just like wrap up a lot of those final like cross the T's, dot the I's on a lot of the systems and mechanics that we've been working on in the background. So fishing is coming, and we're going to be able to have more like missions and trading of goods with the storekeeper. And then we're also introducing more depth to the creatures and how you can interact with them, because right now you can pet them and you can feed them, but there's not more depth to it than that, unless you imply it yourself, which of course a lot of our younger playtesters have been doing, which has been amazing to watch. But we want to also be able to encourage a lot of our older playtesters and players to do that as well. So the way that we want to use Garden of the Sea is basically we want to, when we add a lot of new content, we're going to increase the price a little bit. Mm-hmm. And once the game feels complete or holistic, then we want to come out of early access. But that doesn't mean that we're going to stop updating it. It'll probably still keep getting updated afterwards. But we want to make sure that early access means that we've sort of figured out all of the core systems and the core gameplay and the set of spaces for people to explore that feels good. Like you could just get stuck there and be happy in that space. So you wouldn't feel like you're missing out on anything.
Yeah.
And then we also, of course, with Garden of the Sea are looking towards being very inclusive and using and porting to a bunch of different headsets. So we're looking, of course, at PlayStation, we're looking at Quest, but that's something that we don't want to release on until we're out of early access, because we really want those to be very, very complete and packaged products at that point.
Yeah, that makes absolute sense. I mean, as you say, it's still very early days for the game. And I remember when you actually announced at E3, it was almost like you're releasing too soon.
Yes, exactly.
rather than
way too early access.
Yeah, but it's a great way to do it, because you say it shows how transparent you're being with the game from the very, very beginning. And you've literally not released a prototype. It's already more advanced stage than that, but you've released kind of like your idea, and now you're allowing that idea to be expanded both from your knowledge and insight and the knowledge and insight of the community, which is a really great, cool way to develop a game, I think.
Yeah, we've been loving it.
Like my last sort of question for you today, in terms of the future, because you've chatted a bit about Garden of the Sea. Obviously, you've got Budget Cuts 2 coming up, and the original Budget Cuts is being ported. But with all those games deep in development, I mean, what does the future look like for you? I mean, we've previously chatted about your work on Games Jams, and obviously your experience with AAA studios. But with obviously a new generation kind of coming up and things changing, I mean, do you foresee yourself remaining in VR development for the ongoing future? And how has your experience ultimately been working in VR over these last few years?
Well, VR development has been super fun. I actually did get a chance to work with VR back in 2008 at the Institute for Simulation and Training, which is one of my first tech jobs. But it is like grown by leaps and bounds since then. My future looks very exciting. I mean, Budget Cuts 2 will undoubtedly inspire us to create some more levels, and we're also looking into some new mechanics for further developing the Budget Cuts world. But that's something that we kind of need to overhaul a bit more of the core systems in order to do. So it's gonna again require a little work under the hood, so to speak, and being able to get more of our time and energy over onto Garden of the Sea for a while once Budget Cuts 2 is done, early next year. It's something that I'm super, super excited about. I've started doodling notes at home on my desk. My husband is going crazy hearing about all of these ideas that I get excited about reading in our Discord, or seeing pictures that people draw of concept art of creatures that they want to see in the game. And I'm I need to build this. And he's like, no, you need to sleep so you can make Budget Cuts 2. They need that first. Yeah, exactly. But Budget Cuts 2 is also important, and Garden of the Sea is also important. So I think once we have less cooking at the same time, we'll be able to focus really on getting some of those new features into Garden of the Sea, and that's going to be super exciting. I mean, in terms of the future of VR, I would say that I'm very excited about the next generation of VR. I think inside-out tracking and hand tracking is going to be huge, and I can't wait to see what type of really awesome experiences we get from developers and non-developers, even from game jams, just playing around with these tools and with these little toys and creating moments and experiences with these. I think it's going to be really exciting. I think augmented reality is going to be exciting, but we're not quite ready for it yet. So I'm kind of looking forward to when the hardware and the technology is kind of caught up with our imaginations for augmented reality. And at that point, who knows, maybe we'll start working on some stuff for that. But for now, I think virtual reality still has buckets to offer in terms of new and fun, creative experiences. You're
absolutely right. I think there's so much coming. Obviously, Oculus Quest has changed the game, and you've got the Knuckles support on the Index, and obviously the new headset of PlayStation VR has been talked about. So that there's lots of exciting things coming, and and I'd say you're doing fantastic work at Neat Corporation. It's great to see so much happening with the studio, and this has been really, really fun chatting to you today. So thanks so much for taking the time to come on the show. And
yeah, definitely. This has been super fun. Thank you.
So I guess we're going to sign it off and ask where people can find you, Linnéa, and anything else you may want to share with your audiences before we end today.
You can find me on Twitter. I believe my handle is Roman Lions with a Z at the end. But if you just search for my name, Linnéa Harrison, you should find me on Twitter. And it's usually where we post stuff. Otherwise, I'll be hanging out in our community Neat Corp Discord. So that is the easiest way to talk to me on a day-to-day basis.
That's awesome. Well, thank you again so much for this. It's been so much fun. And that's going to do it for today's show. So if you want your questions them to answer during a future show, please reply in the comment section below or send a message on your preferred social platform and we'll do our best to answer them. And you can even win yourself some goodies if you answer some future questions, so stay tuned for that. But what would you like to see in future PerpCasts? Sound up below in the comment section, so we're looking to make this a show that's informative and interesting to you as possible. You can find Perp Games on Facebook, tweet us at Perp Games, subscribe on YouTube using the link in the description below. You can also find us on Discord, Instagram, LinkedIn, and get all the latest news on our products on perpgames.com. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.